There are names in Hollywood that carry a certain weight, names that, when spoken, conjure images of wholesome entertainment, family values, and the very best of American culture. For decades, these were the faces that graced the most-watched television program in the world, The Tonight Show, and every single time they sat down across from Johnny Carson, millions of Americans smiled, laughed, and felt a quiet sense of comfort. These were the people we trusted, the people we invited into our living rooms night after night without a second thought. But here is the thing that most people never considered. The man who spent 30 years studying human beings more closely than almost anyone else on television. The man whose sharp instincts and quiet observations made him the greatest interviewer of his generation, had seen something in these stars that the cameras were never allowed to capture. He had seen the mask slip. And over the course of his career, Carson kept a mental list of the stars whose private attitudes toward race shocked him to his core. Not because they used an outdated word here or there, but because their racism was deliberate, protected, and powerful enough to shape an entire industry and, through that industry, the childhood of an entire nation. The stories Carson shared with those closest to him paint a picture of a man who was genuinely disturbed by what he witnessed. And what made it so difficult for Carson was that Hollywood had an unspoken agreement. You protect the stars. You maintain the image. You never let the audience see behind the curtain. Carson honored that agreement for most of his career, but in his final years he began to break it. And what he revealed changed the way certain people understood the golden age of American entertainment forever. The names on this list are not obscure figures. They are among the most beloved entertainers America has ever produced, and that is precisely what makes their stories so important. Because if the system could protect people like them, then the question becomes, what did Hollywood itself choose to protect, and why? We are going to go through every single name on Carson's list. Each story is documented. Each story reveals something uncomfortable about the gap between the America these stars projected on screen and the America they helped build behind closed doors. Lucille Ball is a name that carries almost sacred status in television history. She revolutionized the medium. She fought the network executives of her era with a ferocity that few women in Hollywood could match. She insisted on keeping her real-life husband, Desi Arnaz, as her on-screen partner at a time when an interracial marriage on American television was considered radical. CBS pushed back. Ball pushed harder. And for years, that story became the defining narrative of her legacy. The woman who broke barriers. The woman who refused to let the system tell her what was acceptable. Carson knew all of that. Everyone knew that. But Carson also knew something that the public narrative conveniently left out. For all of Ball's courage in fighting for her own marriage to be represented on television, she used that exact same power to make sure her show remained entirely white. I Love Lucy ran for 6 seasons, from 1951 to 1957, and across every single episode, not one black character appeared in any meaningful role. Production memos discovered decades after the show ended reveal that CBS actually suggested in 1955 that a black family could be written into the neighborhood for an episode. Ball personally vetoed the idea. Writer room documents show a pattern of rejection. Scripts that featured black characters in anything beyond background extras were turned down again and again. When Ethel Waters, one of the most respected black actresses of that entire era, was offered a guest spot in 1957, Ball declined. Staff members who were present at the time said she cited audience comfort as her reasoning. Desi Arnaz later addressed this in his autobiography, describing his wife as progressive on some things and backwards on others. It was a carefully diplomatic way of acknowledging something that most people did not want to examine too closely. Under Ball's control, Desilu Studios hired very few minority writers or directors throughout the 1960s, even as pressure from the industry and from the broader culture was mounting. Carson mentioned this contradiction during a private conversation in the 1970s, praising Ball's business intelligence while noting the selective nature of her progressivism. She had been revolutionary for women. She had been regressive for racial representation, and she had wielded enough power to make both of those things invisible to the public at the same time. Bing Crosby gave America a voice that felt like home, smooth and warm and utterly trustworthy. Behind that image was a man who actively refused to share professional spaces with integrated groups of musicians. When Decca Records suggested integrated recording sessions in 1953, Crosby reportedly threatened to leave the label entirely. Louis Armstrong personally confronted Crosby about his refusal to collaborate across racial lines and documented his disappointment in personal letters. A 1954 incident at NBC became legendary among crew members when Crosby walked out of a rehearsal after black backup singers were added without his approval. He did not return until they were removed and replaced with white performers. Staff at Paramount documented that Crosby demanded separate craft services when minority crew members were present on his sets. The man who sang the songs that defined American nostalgia quietly enforced barriers that kept talented black musicians from advancing. Bing Crosby gave America White Christmas. He gave America a voice that felt like home, smooth and warm and utterly trustworthy. His public image was built on wholesomeness, on family, on the kind of quiet patriotism that Americans wanted to believe in. And for decades that image held. But behind it, according to multiple sources documented across several decades, was a man who actively refused to share professional spaces with integrated groups of musicians. Throughout the 1940s and 1950s, as the music industry began, however slowly, to move toward integration, Crosby maintained all-white musical arrangements. When Decca Records suggested integrated recording sessions in 1953, Crosby reportedly threatened to leave the label entirely rather than participate. Louis Armstrong, one of the most important figures in the history of jazz, personally confronted Crosby about his refusal to collaborate across racial lines. Armstrong wrote about the encounter in his personal letters, expressing a deep disappointment in someone he had once genuinely admired. A 1954 incident at NBC became one of the most talked-about stories among crew members for years afterward. Crosby walked out of a rehearsal when black backup singers were added to the arrangement without his knowledge or approval. He did not return until those singers were removed and replaced with white performers. Bob Hope later wrote in his memoir that Crosby's attitudes caused significant tension behind the scenes during their famous road pictures, films that were among the most commercially successful of the era. Carson noticed the pattern during Crosby's Tonight Show appearances. During a 1976 visit, Crosby visibly shifted the conversation whenever the topic moved toward civil rights or the changing demographics of the entertainment industry. Staff members at Paramount documented that Crosby demanded separate craft services when minority crew members were present on his sets. The man who sang the songs that defined American nostalgia quietly enforced barriers that kept talented black musicians from advancing in an industry that was only beginning to open its doors.
Frank Sinatra presents one of the most complicated entries on Carson's
list because on the surface his credentials were impeccable. He championed Sammy Davis Jr.'s career at a time when that support carried real professional risk. He performed at fundraisers for the 1963 March on Washington. He publicly endorsed Martin Luther King Jr. His Rat Pack performances were among the very few integrated shows in Las Vegas during the segregation era. If you looked only at the public record, Frank Sinatra appeared to be one of Hollywood's most genuine allies in the fight for racial equality. But Carson saw something else. Multiple Tonight Show staff members documented hearing Sinatra use racial slurs in private settings, particularly when he believed he was among friends or when he was angry. A 1971 backstage incident became particularly notorious. After a heated political discussion during a commercial break, Sinatra reportedly used a racial slur when referring to black protesters, shocking everyone who was within earshot. Carson spoke about this contradiction in the early 1980s during an off-air conversation that was later recounted by staff members. He described Sinatra as someone who was generous to civil rights causes in public, but capable of cruel and ugly language in private. Members of Count Basie's orchestra documented similar experiences in their biographies, noting that Sinatra occasionally used offensive language backstage in Las Vegas, even while publicly supporting the integration of the Strip's showrooms. What made Sinatra's behavior particularly troubling, more troubling than simple ignorance or outdated attitudes, was that he clearly knew better. His public support for civil rights demonstrated that he understood the stakes, that he understood what racial equality meant and why it mattered. And yet, depending on who was in the room, he became an entirely different person. Carson reportedly told Ed McMahon that Sinatra did the right things for the wrong reasons sometimes. The performative nature of his allyship, the way it could coexist with private prejudice, revealed something uncomfortable about how public progressivism could function as a shield rather than a reflection of genuine belief. Joan Crawford carried herself like royalty and maintained racial hierarchy in every professional space she occupied. A contract clause from the 1940s explicitly stated she would not appear in scenes with black performers in roles of equal status. In 1952, production of Sudden Fear was delayed when Crawford objected to a black actor in a dinner party scene and demanded he be rewritten as a servant. Dorothy Dandridge documented Crawford's outright refusal to acknowledge her in the Warner Brothers commissary, despite both being contracted stars at the same studio. Crawford maintained these attitudes well into the 1970s, long after the Civil Rights Act had passed. Carson later told colleagues she behaved as though that legislation simply did not exist. Charlton Heston marched alongside Martin Luther King Jr. in 1963 and spoke proudly about that experience for years. Carson watched the transformation happen in real time. By the 1990s, Heston began making statements about hip-hop culture and gang mentality with unmistakable racial implications. In a 1997 Playboy interview, he stated that certain communities were not ready for full integration. He placed responsibility on black Americans rather than examining structural inequalities. When he became the NRA spokesperson, he adopted language about inner-city criminals that civil rights leaders immediately recognized as racial dog whistles. Carson reportedly told a producer that the man sitting across from him was not the same man who had marched in 1963. Or perhaps, Carson suggested, it was exactly the same man, and they simply had not seen it clearly enough. Jimmy Stewart embodied American decency on screen. Behind that image, in 1957, he signed a petition opposing the integration of Los Angeles public schools. He hosted fundraisers for segregationists. Politicians. FBI files revealed he provided information to the Bureau about fellow actors who supported civil rights, labeling them as potential communist sympathizers. In 1963, when other Hollywood stars backed the Civil Rights Act, Stewart declined to make any statement, claiming he preferred to stay out of politics despite his very public involvement in opposing integration. James Baldwin documented Stewart's cold reception when they met at a Hollywood party in 1964. The warmth Stewart showed white guests simply vanished. Stewart never publicly acknowledged the contradiction between the heroes he played and the positions he held. John Wayne did not hide. In 1971, he told Playboy magazine that he believed in white supremacy until black Americans were educated to a point of responsibility. His career continued without interruption. He remained one of Hollywood's biggest box office draws. Production documents show he actively campaigned against hiring black actors in lead roles. He rejected Sidney Poitier for a role in The Alamo despite Poitier being the biggest black star of the era. Even in his final interviews before his 1979 death, Wayne never renounced a single statement. Carson told his staff he could not believe America's hero actually believed what he believed. The industry had loved him anyway, which said everything about what Hollywood truly valued. Dean Martin's Rat Pack membership with Sinatra and Sammy Davis Jr. projected an image of integrated friendship. The Dean Martin Show produced 264 episodes between 1965 and 1974, and in not one of them did Martin ever have a single black guest host. Black performers could sing, but could never sit on the couch as equals. In a 1968 NBC meeting, Martin threatened to quit if the network mandated integrated comedy segments, telling executives directly that he did not do comedy with black performers. After Martin's death, Carson broke the industry's code of silence in a 1998 interview, stating explicitly that Martin had racial attitudes that would shock people, that everyone in the industry knew, and that no one had ever spoken about it publicly until that moment. Walt Disney built the most powerful family entertainment empire in American history. From 1923 until 1965, 42 years, Disney Studios employed exactly 0 black animators. A 1938 company memo made the policy explicit. It was not oversight, it was deliberate. In 1946, Disney approved Song of the South despite NAACP protests, romanticizing slavery through the character of Uncle Remus. When Disneyland opened, employment contracts specified white applicants only for customer-facing positions. Floyd Norman, Disney's first black animator hired in 1956, documented years of isolation, being called slurs by colleagues, and eating lunch alone for months. Disney was aware of Norman's treatment and never intervened. The first black Disney princess did not appear until 2009, 86 years after the company was founded. Carson understood that Disney's racism was not simply personal prejudice. It was institutionalized into the fabric of American childhood. When you control what children see as normal, you hold a power that extends far beyond entertainment. For generations, Disney's vision was the first lens through which children understood the world, and it was a world where people of color were invisible, or reduced to servants, or coded as animals desperate to become something more. These 9 names represent something larger than individual failure. They represent a collective decision made by the most powerful people in American entertainment to protect an image at the expense of an entire community. Johnny Carson saw it clearly. He lived inside that system for 30 years, and in the end, when the weight of what he knew became too heavy to carry, he chose to speak.